Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quark Hui Lan. This afternoon, I am delighted to have a conversation with my friend, Dr. Sharon A, who teaches religious studies at Seattle University and a practicing Buddhist. In this episode, we will talk about her most recent book, Emergent Dharma, as well as the relationship between Buddhism, gender, race, trauma, and mindfulness. Welcome, Sharon, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute delight to be here.
I heard about this recent book, Emergent Dharma, and I said I must interview Sharon. Why did you put that anthology together?
First of all, let me just start out by saying it's so great to be able to be on your podcast. I put Emergent Dharma together because it's the book that I've always been looking for. And it's a book that I felt really highlighted what has always been on the margins of Buddhist studies, which is the role and the practices of Asian and Asian Americans, and Asian American women in particular. And the book, in many ways, fights against the grain of the stereotypes of Asians as being passive or Asian American women as being weak and docile. And so I put this book together because I wanted to draw together different voices of Asian American Buddhist women who are practicing Buddhism in ways that traditional Orientalist scholarship didn't really perceive as authentic practice. So in many ways, the book is really resistance, but it's also celebration of what Buddhist women have been doing all along. And, I went to graduate school in Buddhist studies, and when I was in my program, nobody ever cared or seemed to think that what Asian and Asian American lay people were doing were really that important. And yet that was really what I wanted to know. And so this book is really, in many ways, a way of gathering different voices together that have been practicing. And from that gathering, weaving together a more nuanced version of what Asian American Buddhism looks like. And it's been a great opportunity to get Asian American feminist Buddhists together and to highlight that the work that we've been doing, the practices that we've been engaged in are really different from what you might see in popular media about what Buddhism is, as well as the traditional scholarship. I've got about 11, including myself, 11 scholar practitioners in the book that are featured.
I'm curious, how did you find them? Is it through a professional network or through encountering them in practices?
I think it's a little bit of everything, and it's very much in line with the concept of emergent Dharma, which is just bringing together different voices. So a lot of the folks that are featured in the books are people that I've known since I was in my 20s, who've also been Buddhist studies scholars and practitioners. And scholar practitioners have never really been highlighted very much in the field of Buddhist studies. And so these are folks that I've known all along. And the funny thing is, I didn't really know that they had this really deep, rich Buddhist practice because number one, they didn't talk about it. And number two, they weren't practicing meditation all the time. And so in many ways, a lot of these practices are so subtle that they can be overlooked. So some of the folks in the book are members of APARI, the Asian Pacific American Religions Research Initiative, as well as women that I've known really throughout my scholarly career. In addition to that, I also wanted to include voices of practitioners who are outside of the academy because I didn't want it to just be theoretical. I wanted to also explore in what ways has Buddhism been a resource and also maybe even a limitation for Asian American women in particular. So I have a couple authors who are featured that are Zen teachers that are really quite well known mostly in California, as well as Buddhist chaplains and an artist whose work is profoundly Buddhist, and yet she never openly identified as Buddhist, which is, I think, also a very common thing for Asian American Buddhists. There's sort of less of a need to identify ourselves as Buddhist. And so in some ways, that's a positive thing. And in some ways, I think it works against us because if we're not sharing what we're doing or how we view the world through the lens of being an Asian American Buddhist, then we tend to be under the radar. I was at the Sakyadhita conference in Seoul, Korea in 2023, and I'm the president of that organization. And we gathered 2,800 Korean Buddhist women and other international participants. And it was amazing to see this flourishing of 2,800 Buddhist women from all over the world. And that vision was incredibly different from what I normally think of when I think about Buddhist coming together. In the US, it tends to focus predominantly on men, communities of white practitioners. The Sakadita conference featured so many women doing incredible work, and they were really staunch feminist practitioners. And their understanding of feminist practice was really different from what we might be used to in the West, precisely because it's in Asia. So I came back from that conference really excited about what Buddhist women were doing. And so I decided to send out a blanket email to all the Asian American Buddhist women I knew and said, hey, I'm really interested in finally getting this project together. Are you interested? And I would say 90% of the people said yes. And the 10% who said no only said no because they didn't have the time because they were doing other research.
When I first came to the United States in the 80s, people who were doing Buddhist studies were all white men. And of course, in popular media, you have the Oriental monk and you have Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Zen master, talking about meditation, mindfulness all the time. I said, oh, gee, I didn't associate Buddhism with something like this. She's talking about meditation and going to meditative centers. No, we didn't practice it that way. I found this very strange. And so tell us about the practices that some of the women who wrote for your book will do.
There's one chapter in the book that features an author whose practice of Buddhism is really about not even going to temple, but it's really about visiting the gravesite of her parents and bringing her children along as a yearly ritual of remembrance. And it's a way of acknowledging these deep interconnections between generations. And we don't usually think about visiting a gravesite as central to Buddhist practice. These practices tend to be associated with funeral practices and therefore, like, oh, not that important for daily life. But in this particular instance, in this chapter, the author is really highlighting the ways in which this particular ritual practice draws generations together. So, parents and children, and it's a way of establishing an ethics of care and a Buddhist ethics of care for those who have departed as well as those who are still here. And so that is one practice. Another Buddhist practice that I really am so excited to feature and introduce in this book is that of art making. So one of my authors is a sculptor and an installation artist. And so her chapter is really about the ways in which her art practice and her art making was a way of remaking herself after a loss and a trauma. And so I wanted to really look at the ways in which Buddhism could be a creative practice for healing. So one of the interesting things, and I didn't expect this in advance, but one of the interesting things that I found in the book when the chapters came in, and this was hard for authors because I said, I want you to write the piece that you've always wanted to write. And at first they were a little bit worried that it wouldn't be scholarly. And I was like, I don't want it to be scholarly. I want it to come through your heart. And so what ended up happening was that the authors were contributing these pieces that were really about healing and healing the self. And so one of my authors also writes about healing from bulimia through Buddhist practices. And they weren't necessarily Buddhist practices of meditation where you forget the self, but they were Buddhist practices, in this case of meditation, to really embody the body as it is in this present moment. And it's such a beautiful piece because this author is transgendered and grew up in a Chinese American household where there was a lot of discipline about the female body. And so, as a result of this kind of suffering, this author really struggled a lot with eating disorders. And it wasn't until later that they began practicing Buddhism and encountering the Heart Sutra. that the teachings enabled them to really embrace this body as it is. And so, in many ways, a lot of the chapters became these sources of inspiration because you can really see the ways that Buddhism is helping people heal.
I remember you have also written very poignantly about your own relationship with food in the
Yeah.
book Occupy This Body. Can you say something about that book as well?
So that was a book that I never knew I was going to write. And then one day, I just decided I got to get the story down on paper because I've grown up with my mother. I grew up as a Korean American immigrant in New York, and my mother had struggled so much with mental illness and eating disorders. And so I grew up in that context where my mom was, as I highlight in the book, she was bulimic and she was anorexic. And in many ways, I became her scapegoat for that. And as Asian Americans, we don't really like to share our dirty laundry because it's so shame oriented. It looks bad on the family. And yet I felt like there's got to be a way in which I could write the story that would help other people really address one of the most central issues for Asian American women. I am doing the counseling program right now in clinical mental health counseling, and a lot of my focus is on eating disorders for Asian American women. And some of the interesting things that I've noticed in my research is we find some of the highest numbers of Asian American college age women engaging in binge eating. And this is an eating disorder that is in many ways a way of resisting against family. And so everything that I've been looking at lately, including from when I wrote this book, was really about how to address this form of suffering as it relates to racial stereotyping of Asian American women, as well as internal family dynamics that many American women are struggling with. And so that book was one that I wrote that it took me like maybe 9 months to write. And what I realized was that as I was writing it was that I had entered into Buddhist studies as a way of intellectually trying to solve a lot of my own struggles with my own history, but that as I wrote this book, I realized that actually I entered Buddhist studies as a way to fix something that was not an intellectual problem. And so that's sort of what I um, lay out in that book.
What was the response to the book?
I think that the response amongst Asian Americans has been really positive. It's a funny thing when you write a memoir and you highlight the things that are really difficult. On the one hand, I wanted this book to be a resource for people. And then as soon as it was out, I realized, wow, if you read or even Google search this book, you'll know so much about my personal history. And so, in a way, I wanted to connect with other Asian Americans who've experienced similar things. And I believe that that's true. People have reached out to me to just say thank you for writing the book and that they have experienced similar things. And one of the things that happened that was really quite remarkable is that very well known Buddhist teachers that are white female Buddhist teachers also read the book and reached out to me. And that made me feel good that there was a resonance beyond just my intentional original audience. And so it's not that I wanted that for legitimacy, but that it was a crossover. Now, it's not the most popular book. I think that I have downplayed it in a way because it really reveals so much about me and my own struggle. And so part of me is like really glad that I wrote it. And then part of me is like, oh, if you read about it before meeting me, then you have way more information about me than I would have naturally given. So I think that's kind of the nature of memoir in the first place.
It takes a lot of courage to write a memoir. And I don't know whether your parents were still alive when you were writing and publishing it. And so, did you take into consideration of the repercussion? Because the people are very afraid, as you said, to put dirty laundry out there.
Yeah.
So, what prompted you to have that courage? Was that a sense of you want to share the journey as a gift or a way to help others?
I think in many ways it really was not about me. It was
Mhm.
a story that was mine, that I could share and hopefully find resonance with other people who were struggling. And because I knew that they were, but there was no real way to talk about it. And I appreciate what you're asking me about my parents and my family. I'll be honest, I didn't actually start writing this book until my father died in 2015. And I hadn't really thought about it then either. But I think in 2018, I had a research leave and I was thinking about what am I going to write? And then it just hit me that this is what I needed to write. And so I wrote it after my father died. My mother died quite early when I was 24. And then my father died in 2015. And so there was a pretty long period of time where I didn't have my mother, but I still had my father. I knew that my father would understand why I wrote the book. It would have been very painful for him to read that book. And he read everything that I wrote. And so I felt like for my dad, it wasn't the time. Right before the book got published, I did reach out to my brother who lives in Hong Kong. And I let him know that I was going to publish this book. And I was honestly quite nervous about it. I wasn't sure if he would be upset with me. And he really wasn't. He was really supportive. He completely understood why I wrote the book. But he also said he didn't know that if he could read it because it was going to be really painful. And so I just kind of let it go after that. I wanted him to know it was coming. I don't actually know if he's read it. He probably hasn't. But I think that what mattered most to me was that he acknowledged the reasons why I wrote it and that he didn't deny the things that had taken place in the book. So that meant a lot to me.
Thank you very much for writing it. I was deeply moved by your own sense of discovering the past, to name the present, and to dream for a better future, not only for yourselves or for others like you who have experienced family trauma and societal trauma. And now, when you look at the world with two wars going on and also many other conflicts, and what is happening in the United States today, many people are very anxious. The government is shut down. How are you feeling about it?
Ooh. I wish that there was a good word to accurately reflect how I'm feeling. Everything just feels so chaotic and harmful. The critical thinking that we need to really systemically address so many of these problems is being stolen from us through our internet obsession, through our social media obsession. And in many ways, I find myself on the one hand outraged. On the other hand, sometimes as a response to that outrage of all the things going on, I can feel a little bit numb. And I notice when I'm doom scrolling that is a numbing mechanism. And I also feel hopeful, not so much in terms of the large scale destruction that's happening right now, but I feel more hopeful when I have those intimate connections with other people and finding community as a refuge. But I wish that I had a great solution and a Buddhist solution to these problems, but I don't. I think that what Buddhism offers me is an opportunity to cultivate some clarity around the causes and conditions of what's happening. And I know that there's ways that I can cultivate my own practice to make me safer to be around through Buddhist practices. And yes, it's chaotic. Yes, everything is on fire. And yes, there's still moments where we can find, or I can find those connections that help cultivate resilience, because we are living in these unprecedented traumatic times. And I can't think of a more important time where we cut through so much of the nonsense and the fake news and everything that's just meant to make us angry. And of course, to pay money while we're being angered. Not a great solution on my part, but I do think that learning how to take a step back and really discern what is the nature of what's happening and what are some of the things that I can do to alleviate what is happening that's controllable. There's so many things out of our control right now. So the question is, what can I control? And to recognize that what I can control and what I can contribute to, it's important. It's not going to solve the wars that are happening, but it's something. And I think that when I feel hopeless, that's when I know get on the phone, get out of the house, go meet people.
Yes, very good advice. Sharon, you are not only a professor, you are a yoga teacher, and you have also taught yoga to people of color who desperately needed those kind of practices. Can you share what you have done and what you have learned from that practice of helping others?
Yeah, it's been a minute since I've taught yoga just because I've been quite busy. But when I do teach yoga, I love to teach women of color. And I teach from a trauma informed lens. And so that means that I offer a lot of choice making in the yoga that I teach. So for me, yoga is not about creating pretty shapes for other people to look at, which is pretty much what the yoga industrial complex really promotes. But it's really about getting back into the body and remembering and feeling that sense of the body. Because a lot of times when we're under duress, experiencing microaggressions, macroaggressions all the time, our body is on high alert. And so, from a trauma informed yoga perspective, the importance is on really reminding the body how to rest and digest in between those experiences, for example, of racism. And this became really important during COVID because so many of my Asian American sisters and many Black women have been experiencing, we've always experienced this, but it just seems like it was heightened during that time. We experienced so much stress and anxiety in our bodies, and we know it's bad for us, right? This, if we look at all the social determinants of health, racism, sexism, poverty, etc., all of those things are going to take a tremendous toll on our bodies. And so when I teach trauma informed yoga, it's really about learning how to find moments in between those experiences so that we remind our bodies again what it feels like to be at rest. And that way we can increase our resilience and our window of tolerance. And that is going to help us in the long term with all of the health, the negative physical and mental health consequences that racism and sexism and poverty have on predominantly women of color in this country. And so for me, yoga is not about transcending the body, but it's about really getting back into the body. And yoga has never been for me about transcending the social norms or social reality, but it's about learning how to recuperate oneself in the context of a lot of trauma. And a lot of that trauma is economic and social and political. So people always laugh at me when I say that mindfulness and yoga is actually a political act. For me, it really is. It's about cultivating well being and inner resource at a time when everyone's trying to take it away.
That is so true. Taking care of one's body has become a necessary resistance, resisting societal pressure, consumerism, and the norms of beauty or even wellness. Wellness has become an industry, as you know.
Yeah.
Now you have got this more specialized training with a certificate in clinical, or is it clinical psychology?
I'm working on my degree right now in clinical mental health counseling. I'm in my second year and really trying to tailor the programs for, I would say, predominantly Asian American women, because the percentage of what I've learned was quite shocking. The percentage of Asian American therapists out of all the therapists in the US is 1%. Less than 1% are Asian American. And so I wasn't thinking that I was going to embark on an entirely new career, but I did feel like there untapped potential to support Asian and Asian American women in this country. And I've always been an academic and really been interested in the theoretical side of things, but then I really wanted that practice side. It's great to be able to think a lot and write and share lectures and whatnot, but I really felt like I wanted to balance that out with a more direct connection with people who are struggling like I have, or struggling like you have, or struggling like everybody has. And in academia, we tend to have a bit of a protective lens around our own suffering. and we try to theorize our way out of it. But for folks that are not in the academy, and I'm not saying that the academy is a healthy place to be. I think we all need therapy too. But I felt like this was a good way to connect what I've learned throughout my career as an academic with the work that I've done in mindfulness, mindful eating, and trauma informed yoga. I needed a little bit more training, so I entered into the clinical mental health counseling program so that I could provide resources for Asian Americans who, as we know, don't tend to go to therapy because therapy is so highly stigmatized in many Asian American cultures for being self-indulgent and or bringing shame on the family. And so that is why I entered the program, and it's been fascinating. It's also quite humbling to be a student again.
I know that you are also a marathon runner. Always admire what you post on Facebook, that you might be the number one or number two in terms of the runner in your age cohort. Do you take running as a kind of spiritual practice?
I do. When I started running long distance, I really didn't start until after I had my second child. So I think I started when my daughters were 4 and 7, maybe even earlier, because it was the only time when nobody was asking me for something. And the only thing that was happening was that I was asking myself to run. And so, what I've experienced over the years of doing this is that the long distance running, it's like any kind of meditation practice. In the beginning, there's all these thoughts going on in my head, like, oh, why am I doing this? I don't have time. I don't really need to run. Why am I running? And there's a lot of mental resistance. And then there's a time where I just drop into my experience where all of that kind of goes away. And so for me, it is that spiritual experience of dropping in. And I'm not the best meditator of sitting down for hours on end. But when I'm running, when I find that things are getting difficult or things are getting challenging, I always find a mantra for myself that I repeat. And they're kind of funny mantras, but for me, the one that I usually get is just lock in, stay with it, lock in. And it's a way for me being grounded when other things are not feeling okay. I think that really helps me in my daily life where everything is chaotic. I don't want to do something, but then I can sort of lock in and get back down to that grounded sense of a little bit of balance. Marathons are extreme. I recognize that. No one's going to say it's a walk in the park. But the other reason why I do it is because when I run long and when it's hard and I still do it, I feel like that translates into my regular life. This is really hard. This experience I'm having in my everyday life is really challenging. But I also have the experience of going through these marathons where things get ugly, things fall apart, and yet they get done. That for me has always been a really great source of resilience.
It's fascinating talking with you because you are a woman with so many different dimensions and so many talents. It's just like a prism. You turn something and then we see a different aspect of Sharon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here.
If you enjoyed this episode, please click like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.